And welcome everybody. Want to introduce our guest today is the world famous Dr. Doug McGuff. Doug is an emergency room physician, author of the incredible training book, Body by Science, which I've been brushing up on all afternoon. And Doug is also the owner of Ultimate Fitness in South Carolina, and probably one of the biggest names in the super slow, high intensity weight training movement, which we'll get into here in just a second. So, with that, Doug, I don't know if there's anything you want to add about yourself before we jump in.
No, that's a pretty good introduction. The facility name here my training facility is actually Ultimate Exercise.
Oh, what did I say? I apologize.
Ultimate Fitness. It's no big deal.
Sorry.
People do it all
I had
the
it
time.
right here on my paper.
Makes me think I should have changed the name, but in any case, that was stolen off of Ken Hutchins' technical manual because it was super slow, the Ultimate Exercise Protocol. So I just carved a little bit of a subtitle out of that for the name of my facility. But yeah, I've been a resistance training geek ever since I was 14 or 15 years old. And this has all just been an evolution of that interest and passion throughout my entire life. So that's kind of how I got where I'm at. But happy to talk to you guys today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. If you could, just by start, because I think it'll lead into the rest of our discussion, by defining what high intensity exercise really is. I think there's a lot of misconception around it, and a lot of things get labeled high intensity exercise, including bodybuilding, CrossFit, even long distance endurance can sometimes be labeled as high intensity exercise.
Sure. Yeah. So the intensity is always a relative term. Basically exercise is defined by intensity. So when you are laying in bed asleep, that's as far away from exercise as you can get without being dead. Anything above that level, whether it's just walking, slow jog, jogging fast, sprinting, high intensity interval aerobics, CrossFit, strength training, high intensity, exercise, body by science type of thing. That's all just a continuum where the intensity is going up in a stepwise fashion. So in terms of effort, anything above a baseline of as close to zero as possible is an incremental increase in intensity. So to really discuss what this exercise paradigm is trying to accomplish and why we call it high intensity exercise is we have to think in first principles. And the first principle is we are animals. So biological organisms are broken down by taxonomy. So there's King Philip came over for gold and silver, kingdom, phylum, organism, genus, species, all that. So we are in the kingdom Animalia. And so that means we're animals, which are different from the kingdom Plantae, which are plants. Plants are autotrophs. They make their own food. They make their own energy. Animals are heterotrophs, which means they have to go and acquire their food, which therefore means the kingdom animal, their major distinguishing characteristic is movement. So movement is our most preserved biologic function. Without movement, we can't get food and we can't keep from becoming food. So our skeletal muscle is sort of a defining organ or tissue for the rest of the organism. It runs the show. So to the extent that we challenge the skeletal muscle is the extent to which we can make physiologic and adaptations and improvements. So if you make functional improvement in skeletal muscle, all the other tissues of the body benefit from a downward cascading effect because all of the other tissues of the body have to support the mechanical functioning of skeletal muscle. Well, our approach to that is we want to aggressively recruit skeletal muscle by doing work, and we want to fatigue it as deeply as possible in a time-efficient manner. Because if you threaten movement. If you fatigue muscle to the point that it becomes dyskinetic and can temporarily no longer function, you have created a hormetic effect, a hormetic threat to its most preserved biologic function. And that stimulus, that threat to our most preserved biologic function, triggers an adaptive response out of the body. The body will therefore generate an adaptive response of strengthening and then an augmentation of all the metabolic and physiologic subsystems that allow that to happen. So it so turns out that the way to most aggressively recruit muscle is to make certain that it's under a continuous and uninterrupted load. And the way to get the best continuous and most uninterrupted load of muscle is to expose it to resistance and to not allow the musculature to move that resistance quickly enough that the resistance can get moving under its own momentum. Because if momentum is activated, then the resistance is taken off the muscle gets a respite, and the aggressive recruitment and fatiguing of that muscle is compromised. So high intensity resistance exercise resorts to use of resistance that is moved in a slow and smooth fashion so that the muscle never gets a respite. So the fatigue is aggressive and continuous and deep in a meaningful time frame. So that's what the whole approach is about.
Thank you. And I wonder if you could just give us maybe some of the story behind the Body by Science method, or the system that you sort of describe in your book. And for those that aren't familiar with the super slow weight training, how did you get to in your research and development, how did you get to that point? And
how did it get there? Okay, so high intensity exercise was really kind of had its birth with Arthur Jones, who was the inventor of Nautilus exercise equipment back in the 70s. He was the first guy that really identified that exercise did not directly cause beneficial changes in the body, that exercise was simply a stimulus that was brought to the body, and if the body had adequate recovery resources, it would make an adaptive response. So he built his entire system around that, and it worked well. He didn't really focus a whole lot on movement speed. He did apply some constraints to it, saying, don't be very explosive because of momentum and the forces associated with it. You don't want to get injured. But it was basically, their rules were like, lift it in 2 seconds, lower it in 4. Well, in 1983, they partnered with the University of Florida to do an osteoporosis study with elderly women to see if strength training would produce improvements in function and bone mineral density in women that have osteoporosis. But the problem was these women were very frail. They had very thin bones. They were very prone to injury. So they had to devise a training protocol for these women that was going to be safe. So they had to really watch the amount of force that was going to be transmitted onto their bones. The way they went about this was to produce a protocol of exceedingly slow movement, where the weight was lifted very gradually over a course of 10 seconds, and then lowered over a course of 5 to 10 seconds, depending upon the equipment. So to diminish the force that they were seeing, force is mass times acceleration, and they were just trying to take acceleration out of the equation as much as possible so they could strength train these frail women and not hurt them. Well, when they applied this, they found 2 things. 3 times a week was way too much. They couldn't recover. So they went down to 2 times a week. And when they did, they found a rate of progress in these elderly, frail women that was much faster than they had seen previously. The assumption initially was, well, it may be just because they're so deconditioned, we're starting from such a low point that we're getting a running start on things, and that may be why. But what they did was they took the protocol and they applied it to the athletes at the University of Florida, so the athletes that would visit Nautilus training headquarters. And what they found was that accelerated rate of improvement in terms of strength gains, muscle mass gains was evident in younger and healthier people as well. And what they came to realize is that they had simply stumbled upon a mechanism to make the stimulus more aggressive. The muscle was under a more continuous load, which resulted in a more aggressive and rapid and deeper fatiguing of the skeletal muscle, which triggered a more powerful stimulus. But they also figured out that a little went a long way. So you had to truncate how long the workout was out of necessity. And the frequency of the workout had to go out a little bit longer to allow for complete recovery. And that's kind of how super slow was born. And that's kind of the protocol that we largely relied on in Body by Science to kind of create the template for what was going to be the book.
Okay. And do you primarily advocate for full body workouts? I know in your system you focus on 5 primary movements, a compound row, a leg press, bench press, overhead press, and a pull down. But like you mentioned that the stimulus for these types of workouts can be so intense that this should only be done once a week.
Yeah. So the answer to that is a qualified yes, because it's contextual. So the reason we chose those 5 big movements is because they are biomechanically simple and intuitive movements for people to do. So someone that's first starting out a program has movements that are simple to perform so that they can devote most of their concentration to effort and less of their concentration to the coordination of the movement itself. Also, those 5 big movements tend to cover all of the muscular structures of the body. So you're getting a lot of bang for the buck. But at the same time, as one progresses and gets stronger, those big movements bring a lot of stimulus to the body, a lot of punishment to recover from, so to speak. So initially, when you first start out, 5 big, large body movements are recoverable in 3 to 7 days. But as you get stronger, the amount of mechanical work you're doing translates into the amount of metabolic work you're doing, which translates into the amount of, for lack of a better term, damage that your body is having to recover from. So over time, we may start to resort to either truncated routines or split routines where we sort of subdivide the body so that the hole that we're digging that we have to fill back up is not quite so deep. So literally, as you become stronger, it becomes harder for you to recover from a given volume of exercise. So we may slice and dice it. We maybe do 3 big movements and 2 or 3 smaller movements in a given workout, so that as you get stronger, you can continue to progress on a workout by workout basis.
Okay. And for the average person, what would you say is like would be an ideal number of workouts per week? I know some people have a hard time. I think some people read your book and your system and they think it's a 1-day, 12-minute a week system, but it's really more than that.
Yeah. So yeah, there's more to it than that. Again, it's contextual. So if you look at a population, a bell curve distribution of the population with recovery ability relative to the kind of workout that we're advocating, the mean of the population is going to sit quite happily at a once every 5 to 7 day frequency. But if you look in the book, if you read about John Little's Nautilus North study, where he was actually monitoring using a bod pod positive tissue adaptations and what the time course for it was, there was one subject that was recovered and ready for a workout in 1 day. And then there was another subject that didn't reach a positive tissue adaptation for 28 days. There were some subjects there was 12 or 14 days, but on average, it was about every 7th day. So number one, it depends on the person themselves, because differing people have differing recovery capabilities. But 2, the needle is moving, because as you get stronger, you're bringing more metabolic devastation to the system to recover from. So that changes over time. So in the very beginnings, when someone first starts and they're not that strong, most people can train twice a week quite easily, until they start to bump up against a plateau. And then you may want to space them out to, rather than a Monday, Thursday, it may go Monday, Friday, Wednesday, Monday, Friday, Wednesday. And then once they hit another plateau with that, it may space out to every seventh day after that. Okay. So it is a little bit of a moving needle based on where you are in your training and how adept you are at training really, really hard. Mm-hmm. And when you become quite strong and very adept at really emptying the tank, so to speak, that can affect the recovery dynamic. So it's a little bit of a Venn diagram that you have to adjust for over time. But once you become, in the early stages, adept at what workout by workout progress feels like, you can tell when that starts to go away and how to sort of adjust that Venn diagram on the fly.
Okay. And for somebody who's very experienced in training and wants to work out 3 or 4 times a week, are those the folks that you would recommend applying your system of high intensity training to individual body parts and breaking things up? And that way each body part would get worked once a week?
Yes. If that's so there's many different ways to slice and dice. So you got volume, frequency, and recovery. And it's sort of like looking for a job. You can make as much as you want to make, you can work as much as you want to work, and you can live where you want to live. But you can only have 2 out of the 3. So it's the same thing with training. If someone really likes to be in the gym and wants to be there 3 days per week, they need to subdivide their body into a 3-way split. So they can do, chest and back on one day, shoulders and arms on the other, legs and abs on the third, something like that. When my ER schedule gets really, really hectic and my recovery is compromised by work and a rotating shift schedule, I will do one body part at a time about every 3rd day. And then what happens is with each individual workout, you're not digging as deep of a hole, so you're able to recover more quickly. But for each individual body part, you can hammer it a little bit harder than if you were doing your whole body. So there's lots of different ways to slice and dice it based on where you are in your training, but also based upon lifestyle factors at any given point in time.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on overtraining, and what kind of symptoms or what would you advise people to look for when they're assessing their own body and their own ability to recover and where they are?
Yeah, if you really hammer a high intensity workout and you don't allow enough recovery, the first thing you got to kind of get a handle on is that overtraining is not an event. It's a process. So you train on one workout, you come back too soon. It may not be readily evident on that very next workout, but if you keep doing it, what'll happen is you start to accumulate a constellation of symptoms. Number one is that within the workout itself, when you reach fatigue in a fully recovered state, it feels very grindy. Your last repetition or two is experienced as the repetition speed starts to bog down. And, a repetition that, let's say you're doing a 5-5 cadence. On the last 2 or 3 repetitions, you're pushing as hard and as fast as you can, but you make it in 7 seconds. And then the next repetition takes 9 seconds. You complete a final repetition, but it takes 12 or 13 seconds to complete it, and then you fail. When you're overtrained, there's none of that grindiness. You're just moving along, and then you just, bam, run into a brick wall. You fail abruptly and suddenly and without warning, and it feels frustrating, like you've been denied unfairly. So that's the first thing. The second thing that starts to happen is you start to feel like crap. And I think that it's first manifested as a foul mood. You feel like you're on your period. You're just
I don't know what that's
short.
like, but I trust that you're right.
Yeah, you actually do. Men don't think that they do, but they do. You know when you're being a little bitch.
Yeah.
So basically, you start being a little bitch. You're crabby. Someone says something, it hurts your feelings. You're moody. You don't feel upbeat. You don't feel optimistic. You start to feel tired and grumpy. You become hangry more easily. When you go to sleep at night, you'll have more problems with feeling wired and tired. You'll feel like totally tired, like I need to go to bed and sleep. And then you lay in the bed and it's like you start playing the if I fell asleep right now, I would get X hours of sleep game. All of those things will manifest themselves in the process of overtraining. So you just got to be alert to those warning signs and not ignore them. So that's kind of how you can tell. And your overall sense of well-being starts to become degraded. The ironic thing about it is that most people's tendency when they start to experience overtraining is this feeling like their training is not as productive as it should be. So we tap into our Western Anglo-Saxon work ethic, and the natural tendency is to double down and to actually hit it harder and do more.
Mm-hmm.
When at that moment in time, your approach should be the exact opposite, is to decrease your volume and decrease your frequency until you regain that sense of well-being again.
Yeah, it's kind of the CrossFit mindset versus minimum effective dose, and trying to find that just hitting that optimal amount, right?
Yeah. So CrossFit, I like their sense of life. I like their orientation towards there is value in doing hard things. The problem with CrossFit is sort of like BUDS training for the Navy SEALs. It is a selection process. So the people that are successful at CrossFit are the people that have the genetic makeup to tolerate that kind of abuse. And so you end up selecting out for the extreme responders. But what it ignores is the invisible graveyard of people that don't respond well to that and get hurt in the process.
Yeah.
So CrossFit generates its intensity by increasing force. So you're doing ballistic movements, you're doing high-speed movements, you're doing Olympic weightlifting, which was never intended to be a fatiguing protocol. It was intended to be a sport whereby you demonstrate your strength. But strength stimulus requires fatigue. So when you combine a highly skill-based movement with orienting the weight over long levers in joint vulnerable positions and combine that with a fatiguing protocol, you got a prescription for injury. So injuries are rampant in CrossFit for that reason. If you go to their own discussion board, which is not on their main webpage anymore, you got to search for CrossFit discussion board. And you go into the topic of injuries, you'll find that there's over 7,000 posts with several hundred thousand. There's over 7,000 threads with in the hundreds of thousands of posts within those threads in the discussion board about injury. And that's because it is just the perfect prescription for hurting yourself.
Sure. And this kind of just shifting gears, but related to this, it seems like in the fitness industry, there's a lot of lies and misrepresentation. And if you want to take it from CrossFit, bodybuilding, and ultra endurance, what CrossFit tells you is those elite athletes, those biological outliers that you pointed out, and they make everybody think that that's attainable for everybody. Same with bodybuilding. You look at these big guys and you're told that if you only train a certain way, you take these certain supplements, you're going to look like these guys. maybe, with this in mind, I've heard you talk about biological fitness versus fitness towards skill development and pure aesthetics. What exactly is biological fitness, and why should we strive for that?
Yeah. So the first thing is with regard to the fitness industry and how it kind of misrepresents those kind of adaptations. I would first say I don't think it's like a deliberate or an evil conspiracy to mislead the public. I think it's more a natural error of observation. So it's a selection bias that's going on. It's our natural inclination to look at people that are successful and seek the advice from them, when in fact they are just an outlier that's been selected for. So to answer the second part of your question, I think that people naturally conflate a conditioning protocol and a skill protocol. So the mechanism whereby that you can generate the most adaptive response or the most conditioning out of skeletal muscle is one that obeys muscle and joint function, so that you're using whatever muscle in the plane of movement that's defined by its function. So if you want to train the pectoralis muscle, you got to know its function. And the function of the pectoralis muscle is it attaches to the humerus bone so that it moves the humerus or the upper arm bone out away from the chest, in towards the midline, and slightly downward. If you put an electronic muscle stimulator on the pectoralis muscle, that is the position that your arm will end up in. So you want to use a movement that tracks that muscle and joint function. Once you've identified that movement, you want to use a weight so that you aggressively recruit and deeply fatigue that muscle as quickly as possible. But that's the way that you stimulate strength. If you want to demonstrate strength, that's a completely different process. That is a skill conditioning. So if you want to make your pectoralis and your triceps as strong as possible, you want to stimulate it with exercise that follows muscle and joint function and aggressively recruits and fatigues it. If you want to demonstrate the strength that you've built, you need to rehearse the skill of the mechanism whereby you want to demonstrate that strength. So if that's bench pressing, you're going to have to rehearse and practice the skill of bench pressing. If it's going to be some explosive thing like throwing javelin or being an offensive lineman or whatever, skill conditioning has to be something that is completely separate from muscular conditioning. So those two different things are two different activities altogether. So you build as much strength as possible, but to demonstrate it means a rehearsal of that specific movement pattern to demonstrate the strength that you've built. And those movement patterns are very, very specific. So demonstrating explosiveness in a barbell squat versus demonstrating explosiveness as a BMX rider coming out of the gate are two completely different neuromotor pathways that have nothing to do with each other. So if you want to express the greatest demonstration of your strength, you have to rehearse that specific skill. But that skill has to be rehearsed in a non-fatiguing protocol that allows you to develop that neuromotor pathway as specifically as possible. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I've heard that, what you said, another example with baseball, that if you want to get better at hitting, you practice hitting, you don't deadlift.
Right.
You practice your skill.
Right. And the other thing is if you conflate skill conditioning and strengthening, the closer you bring the two together, the worse it is. I don't know if you've seen baseball players warming up in the bullpen when they're getting ready to go to bat, where they put the donut on the bat and swing it with a weight on there. The idea being that once the weight's off, their bat speed will increase.
Mm-hmm.
That is the worst possible thing that you could do because it's close to the neuromotor pathway, but not precisely it. So as you get closer to the neuromotor pathway, the confusion that occurs between the two different neuromotor pathways gets worse. So swinging a donut on a bat right before you go to the batter's box is going to screw you up as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you'll see soccer coaches deflate the ball slightly in practice, with the idea being that the ball speed will increase during the game, when in fact what you're doing is you're massively screwing up the very specific neuromotor pathway for that particular skill. Look, there's a reason that college footballs are of regulation size and weight. Professional baseballs are of regulation size and weight. Basketballs are of regulation size and weight. When you take a college football player and you give him a Duke football that's used in professional football, they really suck until they get adapted to the new regulation size and weight of a professional football. Professional football is slightly different than a college football. And if you cross them over acutely, they will be much, much worse with that new ball because it's close, but not perfect. That conflates neuromotor skill worse than anything. That's how the guys at the carnival end up never having to give away the big stuffed animal at the basketball game,
Mm-hmm.
because the ball is either slightly different in weight or the hoop is slightly different in height. So anyone that's skilled at shooting basketball, that's why the better they are, the worse they perform. If you get a collegiate basketball player and you take him to the state fair, he thinks he's going to win the bear for his girlfriend. He's the guy that's going to screw it up the worst,
Mm-hmm.
because his skills are highly refined for a very specific ball weight and hoop height.
Oh yeah, those hoops always look like they're like 14 feet high and 80 feet away. But
Yeah.
Switching gears just a little bit, could you maybe talk about the cardio myth and you know how a lot of people don't believe that weightlifting is an effective tool for building cardiovascular endurance. My mom once even told me, you can't just lift weights all the time. You need to get on the treadmill. And I told her, well, if you lift weights correctly, you are working your cardiovascular system. So I don't know if you maybe share some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. So that false dichotomy that we have created between strength training and endurance or aerobic type exercise is kind of a peculiarity of the evolution of exercise physiology. First is weight training as it was practiced in the 1950s and 60s was done specifically as a skill adaptation for Olympic weightlifting and later powerlifting. So long periods of rest were taken between movements because the idea was to demonstrate as much strength as possible, not to produce the best strengthening stimulus, which involves rapid and deep fatigue. So there's that. Concurrent with that, exercise physiology labs, their only measurement tool in the 1960s and early 1970s was VO2 max, which is the measurement of oxygen uptake. What that required was a tight-fitting mask hooked to long hoses to a large piece of machinery that measured the partial pressure of oxygen that was being sent to the subject and the partial pressure of oxygen as it exited the breath and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide that was being expired to calculate oxygen utilization and where that would plateau off. But to use that measuring tool, the subject, because of all these big tubes and stuff going to this big stationary machine, the subject had to be stationary, which meant that the only thing that you could really do that sort of testing on was either a treadmill or a bicycle ergometer. But as we now know, any sort of muscular work that's done produces positive physiologic adaptation. including positive physiologic adaptations in the cardiovascular system. So those positive health benefits ended up getting linked to aerobic type exercise because that was the only type of exercise that we could measure. So aerobics and the cardiovascular benefits ended up becoming linked in everyone's mind to the extent that steady state exercise that emphasized the aerobic subsegment of metabolism became intrinsically linked so that we started to call aerobics cardio. But what was lost in the whole equation was when the whole world, when your only tool is a hammer, the whole world becomes a nail. And that's how aerobics got linked to cardio. But what's being ignored is that the aerobic subsegment of metabolism is that part of metabolism which occurs in the mitochondria. But the mitochondria gets all of its food from the anaerobic subsegment of metabolism. So when you do higher intensity exercise, you're metabolizing glucose through a 20-step process called glycolysis down to a molecule called pyruvate. That pyruvate gets moved into the mitochondria, acted upon to generate much more ATP. But the only way you can upregulate that aerobic subsegment of metabolism is to increase pyruvate delivery. The only way to maximally improve aerobic metabolism is to deliver pyruvate as fast as possible. That requires high intensity exercise. You literally deliver pyruvate to the mitochondria faster than it can take it up. When that happens, that pyruvate gets acted on by an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase, makes lactic acid. That's where you get your lactate threshold. That's where you start breathing hard to blow off carbon dioxide. That's where you start to feel the fatigue in the muscles and you can't go on. But by having done that higher order exercise, you ramped up the aerobic subsegment of metabolism as much as it is possible. So you get the most adaptation out of that possible. Secondly, when you have to stop and rest, all that lactate over the next half hour gets converted back into pyruvate, shuttled through the mitochondria, and you get the same sort of benefit as if you were doing steady state exercise on a treadmill for 45 minutes. That is why the researchers that look at high intensity interval training show that there's just as much aerobic benefit from a 4-minute Tabata protocol as there is from 45 minutes on the treadmill. Well, the type of resistance training that I advocate is like high intensity interval training, only better because the intensity is higher and the forces are lower. And you're fatiguing yourself as you go along, so you become literally too weak to hurt yourself. So that's how properly performed resistance training actually trumps steady state aerobic exercise.
Awesome. Thank you. I got a question for you. I was reading the chapter of your book on fat loss last night, and I wanted to just ask you, can you outwork a bad diet?
No.
No.
Nothing outworks a bad diet. And the problem is that in contemporary Western society, a bad diet is so bad that it's a complete evolutionary mismatch for our metabolism. So, number one, we have an abundance of food that's continuously available. And we evolved in an environment where energy intake was very episodic and was punctuated by long periods of energy deficit. So we're not in that environment anymore. So number one, we have unless we're doing intermittent fasting, which I highly recommend, unless we're doing that, we have no mechanism whereby energy intake is ever punctuated by lower energy states. Number two, most people's continuous energy input involves highly novel compounds from an evolutionary standpoint, like levels of sugar and carbohydrate that are unprecedented in our biologic history, and by carbohydrates that are very easily brought into the cell and overwhelm the cell's metabolic machinery. Fructose in particular does not require a GLUT transporter, does not require insulin to get into the cell, but your poor cell and mitochondria are forced to deal with that. So you have a diet that's bad in an evolutionary novel way that your body has no way of dealing with. There's no way you can exercise your way out of that. But you have a lot more latitude for behavior in that context with high intensity exercise, because that very aggressively empties the largest glucose reservoir in your body, which is skeletal muscle. But if you pair that aggressive glucose emptying with intermittent energy intake that avoids these novel compounds like high fructose corn syrup, fructose, sugar, industrial seed oils like omega-6 fatty acid, linoleic acid, that poison the mitochondria's ability to deal with this onslaught of energy intake that's uninterrupted, then you leverage evolution to be on your side rather than working against you.
Okay. And I just wanted to ask you, have you seen the Game Changers? And
I've seen the YouTube ads for it and the previews for it, but I'm not watching it. No.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll skip
and
that.
I'll go off on it for you for a second. Okay.
If you'd like to go ahead.
I would love to.
Okay.
You'll find that a lot of people that are advocates of that are largely government rent seekers, Arnold Schwarzenegger being at the very top of that pyramid. The governor, I mean, look, the reason that there's such a big push towards vegetarianism and veganism is largely because we are required by law to have every gallon of gas that we pump into our automobiles to be 10% ethanol. And the fact that that law exists is what has turned the American population into human grain disposable depots, which is what's poisoned our diet. So during the Great Depression, farmers were going bankrupt and they were destitute. So the government enacted grain subsidies to help support them. Those grain subsidies, once recovered from the Great Depression, never went away because farmers became dependent upon it. And it was a signaling distortion to the economy that required and encouraged grain monoculture, grain monocrop processing, which resulted in the distortion of our food supply, which resulted in the metabolic destruction of the populace. So now that keto diet, intermittent fasting, carnivore type diets are getting a foothold, that's a very big threat to people that are dependent upon government subsidies for monocrop agriculture. So that's why these sort of propaganda type documentaries are being made to try to stop the movement that is going to potentially undermine these rent seekers that have become dependent on sucking off the government teat.
Yep.
So that's kind of my rant on that. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I completely agree. The food pyramid just drives me crazy because it basically promotes that the middle class eat and live on wheat, corn, and soy because it's the most economical way to feed the masses, but also that the the people who sit at the top of the food pyramid in terms of money and agribusiness pretty much promote that's the line they feed everybody.
Yeah, my father died of Parkinson's disease, and he was first diagnosed during a period of time where the government was very strongly pushing that animal fats were bad. Everyone was using corn oil. Everyone was using mazola and margarine instead of butter. And from the standpoint of his disease, that was literally like pouring gasoline on the fire. It was the worst possible thing that he could have been doing. It's a huge, huge mistake. So yeah, it's really unfortunate.
Sure. Yeah, I think, and I would encourage everybody to read The Grain Brain. if they're interested to know
Yeah.
how grain consumption affects your brain health, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Dr. McGuff, I know we're getting close to a time here.
Sure.
Most of the people that we work with, that we try to reach out to, are those over 35, between say 35 and 65. So that said, what are the top 5 things that you would recommend to people as they get toward their 40s and beyond to achieve optimal health and longevity?
Okay, so let's look at diet. I think once you reach age 35 or 40, you need to be very aggressive about eliminating refined carbohydrate from your diet altogether. Second is to be aggressive about eliminating industrial seed oils from your diet as much as possible. They undermine your metabolic machinery to an extent that accelerates aging. The third, so that's 2 things. Third is to be meticulous, to understand that nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. There are no superhumans. So you need to be a good human, meaning taking good care of yourself. So that means very good hydration and very good sleep hygiene. And finally, I think you need to be aggressive in addressing your skeletal muscle, because the basis of all of our biology is movement. So I really don't care if you use my protocol or some other protocol for weight training. I would prefer that you don't do anything explosive or ballistic that could result in injury. But I think more important is don't injure yourself, but just lift weights and do it aggressively, because that addresses your most preserved biologic function. And because of myokine signaling, because of hormonal signaling that comes from the skeletal muscle, that is going to cascade down in a way that acts as a lever to amplify the results from everything else that you're doing. If you do everything else devoid of hard muscular work, you will derive some benefits. But if you want to scale those benefits, you have to address it on the demand side of the equation by doing hard work with skeletal muscle. If you do that, then you're not just pushing with a rope. You're really going to leverage the benefits of everything else that you're doing. So I think everything that you guys advocate on your website, the lever that makes that really move is to do hard exercise.
Okay.
And I think that's really important as someone ages. One thing I would ask people to look up is just Google the name Simon Milov, M-E-L-O-V, the study that says resistance exercise reverses aging in skeletal muscle. This is the only documentation of age reversal in humans in the history of man. And it documents reversal to youthful expression of mitochondrial DNA in humans as a result of 12 weeks of resistance exercise. Nothing else has done that. Now, if anyone's paying attention to David Sinclair and his work on aging and the Horvath clock and restoring a normal methylation pattern, we are on the brink of being able to literally turn back the clock and reverse aging both at the genotypic and phenotypic level. But for anyone my age or anyone in their 40s or older, you are going to need strength training to hold that clock back long enough for that technology to come to fruition where we will be able to use it. My kids are going to be the beneficiaries of that technology, no doubt. For guys our age to be the benefits of that technology, you're going to have to do the right things. And the foundation of those right things is hard work with skeletal muscle. Movement is life. Movement against resistance is life elevated. That's my message.
Motion is lotion, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, Dr. McGuff, this has been really awesome. I appreciate you so much taking the time out to come and chat with us and for our listeners, and for anybody that's watching that wants to learn more about Dr. McGuff and his system and the things we talked about in greater detail. I highly recommend you pick up Body by Science, which we will link up below the video and below the post that we'll put on our website. I appreciate your time, Dr. McGuff.
Yeah. Hey, and if anyone wants to consult with me, reach out to me. The way to find me and all YouTube videos, anything else, is through my website, which is drmcguff.com. That's drmcguff.com. And they can find me there.
And what's your Instagram handle if they want to look for you there?
It's ultimate_exercise_.
Not ultimate_fitness, right?
Nope, ultimate_exercise_.
I won't make that mistake again. I apologize.
Yeah, no sweat.
All right, man. Well, thank you again, and have a great weekend, Dr. McGuff. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right, my pleasure.
Thank you.